If you aren't already familiar with Web Portal, it's an open online communications hub for security-related information. It's a forum that allows you to post time-sensitive announcements, such as be on the lookouts, as well as allow individuals who are not prospective users the ability to request an officer for assistance. This feature allows a person to submit a request from a list of predetermined request types, which in turn automatically generates a dispatch within the dispatch application. From there, on-duty dispatchers can review the request and allocate resources appropriately to respond to that request. In a previous video, we looked at the general setup and configuration of a web portal page. In this video, we'll focus specifically on the Request an Officer feature, but we will touch on some specific dispatch administration functionality that was not discussed previously. Also, this video deals specifically with this feature and the dispatch application, which is accessed separately from Perspective from the main launch page. If you have not upgraded to the newer dispatch application and are still currently using Dispatch Log, then please watch the web portal Request an Officer Dispatch Log video, as the setup for this is different from what we're about to look at. Let's get started. As with the previous videos you may have already seen on setting up the web portal, at the top of this section is an option to enable this functionality. If you do not use Dispatch, ensure you uncheck this box. For the fields that are listed below, ensure that you make them visible and potentially required as you see fit. Before we get into the rest of the fields, let's jump into the dispatch and take a look at some settings and some of the prep work that's required there before we can complete our configuration here. For the setup we're about to look at, you will need to have administrator access to dispatch. First, we're going to look at the zones and teams area. Considerations here that we need to think about are 1. When we start the configuration of the web portal, we must identify an operational zone where the submitted requests are going to be coming to. Every organization that uses dispatch must have at least one operational zone. However many more you have is dependent on how your company operates. But remember that if you do have more than one, dispatchers can only view the dispatches for a single operational zone at a time. The next consideration is that within each operational zone are smaller working zones. These smaller areas within the operational zone identify where the events are occurring. Not the actual physical location of the event, but the general area where the location would exist. As well, this will help determine which officers can respond, as officer teams can only respond to the events in the work zone or zones that they have access to. So again, a part of the configuration that we're going to see coming up is that we must select a default work zone for the request. If you have more than one work zone, then strong consideration is needed here to ensure that when someone makes their request, you have officers on duty that can respond to events in that particular work zone. Next, we need to take a look at the locations. A required field that must be identified when a request is submitted is the dispatch location. In this case, the list of available locations does not pull from your Perspective site rollups, but instead from the dispatch locations that are already created within the dispatch application. So, you'll need to ensure that you have all of the possible locations created as needed. Finally, the last area in the dispatch settings to take a look at are the templates. When somebody submits a request, they will only be able to select from a pre-built list of request types that you identify. And we will see coming up that this list is going to be built by selecting templates that have already been created in this area. So when it comes to templates, what we're doing here is we're defaulting as much of the general dispatch detail as possible. So once a submission is made, all the dispatcher has to do is review the information, maybe perform a little bit of updating, but then dispatch their officers as needed. In here, we have to identify the call category of the dispatch, a default priority for the event. We can identify the call source. We can also add a description if something makes sense to put in here, but also note that there is an information field on the submission where the individual can identify more detail on what they're requesting, and this will appear in this description field as well. Anything added in the initial notes will appear in the messages panel and could be used as a starting point for a conversation with the responding officer or as just quick updates on the dispatch. Just below is an area where you can pre-create officer tasks that are related to the dispatch, if it makes sense to add these. And lastly, up at the top, you have to identify the operational zones that this template can be used in. Ensure that you select the appropriate zones. Also, you must give this template a name and a code. A consideration here is, will this template be used for just these web portal requests, or could this template also be used by dispatchers potentially on a daily basis as well? If the template is only going to be used for web portal requests, then you might consider adding something into the name and/or code of the template that tells the dispatcher this template is for potential web portal submissions. Now that we've looked at this, we can move back into the web portal. The next field we have to identify is the scheduled dispatch name. This is related to the checkbox just above, Allow Schedule Officer, which allows somebody to make a request for a future date time. So any requests that are made for a future date and time, once submitted, will be created in the Schedule Dispatch panel. This is just going to name that scheduled request, so my dispatchers will know where that request came from. Then, which operational zone will this web portal request be active in? As discussed earlier, which should be the default work zone for these requests? The officer field can be a little tricky in the sense that this is really just identifying who the dispatch was entered by. This is something that you may not notice because on a normal user-created dispatch, the call entered by person is automatically the logged-in dispatcher that actually created the dispatch. And this is only seen when you go into the dispatch details. Since this process is automating the generation of a dispatch, the system can't assign a person itself. So you just have to identify somebody here. Next, you need to identify what people can request officer assistance for. This is done by selecting the appropriate template and then assigning it a request type or alias. This request type is what the person will see as their available request types that they can select from. At any time, if there is a need to do so, you can remove these request types by selecting them from the list and clicking the Remove. Really quickly now, let's take a look at this functionality in action. This concludes our topic of configuring the Request an Officer feature. For more information on the general setup and configuration of the web portal or the report an incident, please feel free to watch those respective videos.